we're exploring the mourning process in more depth, so looking at it psychologically and theologically. And while we've been doing this throughout the course, at this point, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper and look at some of these dynamics. And so this week, again, in two parts, we're going to look at some of the distinctions that are made in the literature about grief and grieving and mourning and ways of processing through. Of course, we can't touch on everything. Then we're going to look at a few ways of responding, doing some reflecting theologically, and then finally, I put a couple of links there for some helpful videos that I think are worth watching. One of them is by Todd Billings, one of the authors in the recommended section, a theologian and professor at Western Seminary. And he's having a conversation with a poet. Christian Wyman is his name. And they're both talking about what it's like to experience their own grief of having incurable cancer and being, married and having children, kind of processing through that in their own unique ways and coming at it very differently, philosophically, theologically, and so on. And so I encourage you to watch that. It's about an hour or so, but I think it's worth your time. So that's kind of where we're heading. As we move into this week, first I thought I would just highlight the distinction that the literature makes between grief and grieving. And so grief is the part that comes over us. So when we experience a loss, we have an inevitable emotional experience that we don't really have much control over. And that's why for some people it becomes so distressing as we feel helpless, we feel overwhelmed, our thoughts and things are fragmented, it's hard to make sense of things. It's why sometimes just basic tasks, remembering to eat, remembering where we left our keys and things like that can become overwhelming. And what will become important is that then as we move to grieving, that's what we do in this state of feeling overwhelmed emotionally, psychologically, and so on and so forth. So the first part is passive. We don't really have any say or any control over that. Because again, grief comes over us. And then when we switch to grieving, now we have the opportunity to respond. And this will become significant as we look at the different ways that people have chosen to respond and continue to choose to respond. And one of the key factors we'll see is that having the capacity to feel like we're making choices and we're doing something, we're utilizing our agency is really powerful in the grieving process. So you see here, grieving, I like the way that Mitchell and Anderson describe it as moving towards a receding goal, as if, we'll never really get there, but we do move forward. People who've experienced, horrific things in life do envision themselves in the future, do develop new relationships. They would have told me that life can be good and enjoyable again. Not the same, but they do move forward, they just never really arrive. So grieving is a lifelong journey. And then you see some of the aspects that Mitchell and Anderson point out, that they have some goals that, again, kind of touch on some of the literature that we've read, enable the person to move forward with, not by cutting and severing the ties or the bonds, but reorganizing them, reestablishing the bonds. And so then they can move forward with their life being unencumbered. So not feeling stuck, not getting into complicated grief and grief reactions and those sorts of things, psychopathologies and so on. And then being able to remake emotional attachments with others, live with the reality of the loss, and then deal with the emotion. So that's sort of how Mitchell and Anderson break it down. And again, here, a grief reaction is the term that describes when we are feeling overwhelmed, when we're feeling helpless. This often is the initial shock, the initial pieces, as I mentioned earlier, where it's hard to really make sense of things. And others who have written about grief then point out that the moment that the grieving shifts, and if someone can find that they are now choosing to respond in particular ways, Addig is one that uses this language, that can be really, really powerful. So in grief responses, now we begin to choose, how am I going to respond in light of this, reality that I'm faced with? Am I going to understand myself in new ways? Am I going to reconnect? Am I going to sort of get stuck? And that seems to be a key factor of allowing people to feel like they, even if they're small choices or day-to-day choices, that they're responding in some ways that are of value to them, that align with their worldviews and hopes for their future and so on and so forth. And then, of course, when we are working with someone and helping them to grieve, we want to acknowledge that they are whole beings. And so grieving needs to include all the factors of their embodied life. So it's not just an emotional, psychological process, or for us in theological studies, it's not just a spiritual process, but it's physical, social, emotional, all of the above. And we can encourage others to grieve in ways that are most helpful to them. A little bit later, we'll look at a couple of different types that have been identified, and then we'll sort of unpack what those are. But for our purposes, I would say, as we're working with others, we can just encourage them to find what is most meaningful to them and what is helpful, and encourage a multifaceted approach that acknowledges the various aspects of their life and identity. As we switch now sort of to the next phase of what I want to go through, I had you read a number of chapters in Worden's text. Worden, of course, is a classic, and there's been 3, 4, 5, maybe even this is the 6th edition, I can't remember, of this text, because it's one of the standards. And he has chosen to use the word tasks rather than stages or phases or other. Melissa Kelly, talks about the mosaic. And again, the reason that he uses tasks, in my opinion, is that he's picking up on that distinction between the grief reaction and the grief response, and he's really elevating the response part of it. And by giving people tasks that help them feel like they're progressing, that they're processing through something, that they're moving forward, that can be particularly helpful. Because again, we've deconstructed some of the cautions, I guess I would say, of phases and tasks and stage models, but they still can be helpful. They can provide a framework. They can give language for people where they really just feel out of sorts and chaotic and don't really understand what they're experiencing. Having a nice framework like Worden's task could be helpful, and they can say, oh my goodness, I feel like I've worked through number 1 and I'm kind of in number 2 of really acknowledging the pain. So long as we use these sorts of things as frameworks that we hold loosely, and we can adapt and be flexible, and we don't force people to fit into the mold of whatever model we're using. So you see Worden's tasks: accept the reality of the loss, work through the pain, adjust to the environment in which the person is no longer there. So the environment is different. The survivor and those left behind are now different. And again, they've adjusted their identity, hopefully, or they're in the process of doing that. They've adapted their bonds with the lost person. And they're adjusting to that, which is hard work. I mean, think about how long it takes us to develop our sense of identity in life generally, through adolescence into early adulthood, and probably lifelong, really. And then when we have a significant loss, especially if we lose a loved one, and we are in the process of mourning, in a sense, we have to redo that work. We have to now understand and, in a sense, recreate who we are in light of this particular loss. And then finally, we get to the place of emotionally relocating the lost person. Again, finding a place to carry them with us, but in a different way. And of course, we could break down those tasks in more detail, but I want to get onto some other things in this particular week. So moving on to the shapes of grieving, this goes back to Mitchell and Anderson using this language. And I kind of like this language because it's a little more fluid. It gives a little more space. It's less linear, even though Worden does a nice job to say that his tasks aren't necessarily linear. Everybody always views numbered sequences as linear, so that's the downside. And so shapes gives a little more space, a little more room to have someone kind of move about different facets and not feel like there's a progression necessarily. And so you see searching for the lost object, the chaotic experience or randomness, grieving, doesn't always follow this nice, neat structure. Normalizing that can be really helpful for people, along with the spiral process, that they can kind of get through a phase, get through an experience, and then it will resurface. And again, reminding them that it's ongoing, it's lifelong. Time distortion is another aspect they highlight, where again, people can sort of get stuck or frozen in time, or can somehow mistake things, get confused. And I think, again, we just want to normalize that and help someone talk through their understandings, and then encourage self-focus, at least initially, which again can sound narcissistic or self-centered, but in the grieving process, it can be really helpful to take some initial focus and say, I just need to focus on myself and do some processing. Now, if that becomes extended and the person becomes isolated and they've disconnected from all their sources of support, that would become problematic. But in general, it's an okay thing. So we hopefully would encourage that, not have someone feel particularly guilty if they find themselves needing some more space and time. The way that I tend to approach that is just to let them know that I'm available, and we'll check in periodically, but we'll try to give them the space that they need. And so if I haven't heard from them in maybe a week, maybe I'd send another text or email or something and just say, hey, just wanted to see how you're doing, and leave it at that sort of thing. Continuing to let them know that we're available. Another factor in considering how someone processes through grief, psychologically, emotionally, is the different mediators that Worden identified. And he went through a whole list of different things. So I've highlighted 7 of them here. And of course, that the context will make a difference no matter what. But he did a nice job of sort of articulating how these factors can show up, how they can shape the grieving, and maybe have someone lean more towards the complicating factors or less towards the complicating factors. So for today, I don't want to talk through all of those because I trust that you read through that chapter. But just be mindful that the particularities of any situation will shape the grieving process, the person who's grieving, and then it should shape our pastoral care with them, because we should be adaptable and flexible enough to shape our care to fit the particular context. Okay, so before we wrap up for this first section, as I mentioned, I wanted to talk a little bit about the styles of grieving, which Worden, if I remember right, touched on a little bit, but didn't really go into much depth. But Doka and Martin have identified, and others have picked up on this as well. I think Melissa Kelly might have touched on this also. 2 main types of grieving, the intuitive style and the instrumental style. And the intuitive is more what we think about expressing feelings, embracing the affect, wanting the social experience. So these persons would be the ones that seek out the grief groups and want to go to that and feel like that's a important, significant part of their healing journey, the part of being together, sharing stories, feeling connected, and having solidarity, and basically expressing emotions and so on. Then in contrast, the next style is the instrumental style, and this is more of a cognitive, problem-solving approach that the person might still be emotional and feel emotions, but they're more muted, and they tend to just be one that wants to do something. And so they might use their grief and turn it into a new focus, or a new project or a new purpose that they then work towards. And the way that they're grieving is kind of working out this feeling useful, feeling productive, feeling like they're doing something. I think of times where maybe a parent has lost a child and then they develop an organization. One of the classic ones was Mad Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There's been, cancer survivor sorts of things, breast cancer things, all sorts of things. And I think that is a way for instrumental style grievers to really use the pain and the anguish that they're in and try to do something that is productive and meaningful and will help others. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive. There's some overlap. And there even is a blended style that has elements of both. But what they point out in their studies is that if we identify strongly with one style or the other, we should stick with that style, because if we try to force ourselves into a different style, there's a dissonance, and it inhibits the grieving process rather than improves it or makes it better. So if someone is really strongly an instrumental style griever, and we force them into sharing all of their emotions and going to a grief support group and so on and so forth, that will be less productive than maybe if we meet with them one-on-one or encourage them to, express their grief through the instrumental style of something that's really meaningful to them. Okay, so for the last part of this, or for the last slide of this first part of this week's lecture, I again put this chart back in the PowerPoint, which you've seen before, but I thought it might be helpful again as we're looking at these processes just to remind ourselves of the different ways that authors have organized their way of thinking about the process of grief that someone goes through. So again, you see Kübler-Ross's classic there on the one side, and Worden, which we read quite a bit this week, on the other side, and then Parks, who's cited quite a bit, and Sanders a little bit less, are there to give their ways. And there is sort of a general consensus, we might call it a loose progression, where you kind of move from denial, place of shock and numbness, through feeling the emotional pain and the anger and despair, disorganization, and eventually getting to a place of acceptance, renewal, moving forward, and so on. So that's sort of a general progression that you see in each of them. But anyway, I thought it might be helpful just to see them side by side again. Okay, so that's the first part. In the second part, we're now going to look at some factors of complicated grief, and then some ways of responding and some ways of thinking theologically about this process.